Hi, my name is Dr. Allison Ragland, and I work in the Student Life Multicultural Center as Social Justice Engagement Specialist. In this session, we'll be talking about identity, particularly dominant and minoritized identities. We'll also be talking about privilege and why it's important to reflect on our identities so that we can have better relationships with others. In the previous session, you delved into the concept of identity. We will now further that discussion by focusing on identity, power, and privilege. In this session, we will cover the following. First, we'll introduce the concepts of dominant and minoritized groups. Second, we'll discuss the concept of privilege in relation to dominant and minoritized groups. We'll also discuss the importance of being aware of your own identities and privilege. In the previous session, you reflected on your multiple social identities. For this session, we are going to continue that conversation about identities, noting how they interact with larger social structures. Before we delve into the topic, it is necessary to understand the concepts in this presentation in relation to macro-level structures. We are socialized to think about issues of power, privilege, and oppression on an individual level. For example, usually we learn about racism as the intentionally harmful acts of individual extremists, instead of learning about racism as a culmination of institutional, societal, and historical practices and policies that exist within and impact all sectors of society. But racism, as well as other isms, function on a societal and institutional level, as well as the individual and interpersonal levels. For example, racism permeates policy and law, housing, media, education, and every other institution. It's so much more than one person being mean to someone else because of their race, although this one-on-one level interaction is often what people think of when they attempt to define racism without historical or societal context. By the end of this lesson, we will address how these macro-level structures can impact our interpersonal interactions and relationships. Try your best to think about the concepts from this lesson in relation to broad societal structures in order to best understand them. First, let's discuss the concept of dominant groups. Dominant groups are groups that have access to societal power. They are also seen as the norm in society, and other groups are seen as a deviation from the norm. These examples indicate groups that have historically had access to societal power and are usually seen as the norm. They are also typically represented more than other groups in media, politics, and in higher education, as well as positions of power across various sectors due to long-standing inequities. Next, let's discuss the concept of minoritized groups. Minoritized groups are groups that do not have access to societal power. They typically have less access to resources and rights, and they are expected to function within the norms of the dominant group. These examples indicate groups that have historically lacked access to societal power and that are not usually seen as the norm. These groups also have less representation in media, politics, higher education, and positions of power across various sectors due to historic inequities. There are a few reasons why the word minoritized is used here instead of minority. First, minority indicates a smaller number of people. Minoritized groups do not necessarily have to be the minority of people in society. For example, globally, women, people of color, and working class people make up the majority of the world's population. However, because these groups have historically lacked access to societal power and rights, they are considered minoritized groups. Second, the word minoritized indicates an action. Because power imbalances between identity groups are so pervasive and long-standing, we are conditioned to seeing them as natural. However, it is important to remember that these power imbalances are the result of policies, laws, and practices that have benefited the dominant groups and disadvantaged minoritized groups. Let's look at some examples. Of the identity groups on the screen, some are dominant groups, meaning that on a societal scale, these groups have had access to institutional power and are seen as the norm in society. Some of these groups are minoritized groups, meaning that they have historically lacked access to societal power and are seen as a deviation from the norm. Can you identify which groups would be considered dominant and which would be considered minoritized? It's also important to remember that most people have some dominant and some minoritized group identities. An individual's combination of identities plays an important role in shaping their experiences, worldviews, and blind spots. It's important to remember that dominant and minoritized identities are about which groups have access to societal power. Because dominant groups have societal and institutional power, they also have access to privileges that minoritized groups do not have. In the next section, we will discuss the concept of privilege in greater detail. Let's think about the concept of privilege in relation to dominant and minoritized groups. Privilege is an unearned advantage that is granted based on one's dominant social groups and denied to members of minoritized groups. Privilege is something that members of dominant groups do not usually have to think about, while members of minoritized groups have to think about it often. For example, able-bodied people often do not have to think about whether the spaces they enter will be accessible. They do not have to call ahead and check the accessibility of events that they will attend. If an elevator is broken, they can simply walk up the stairs. These are privileges, specifically able-bodied privileges, that illustrate the fact that privilege is simply something that you can take for granted because you do not have to face a particular hardship as a member of the dominant group. This chart shows some of the main identities that confer privilege in U.S. society and their relationship with groups that do not. Remember, identity is complex. You can have some privileged identities and others that are not. To say that you have privilege does not mean that you have had an easy life, nor does it mean that you come from a wealthy family or that you have never struggled. To say that you have privilege simply means that based on your dominant identities, there are things that you do not have to think about. This matrix shows the intersections of privileged and oppressed identities. Remember, many people have some identities that bring privilege and others that do not. Also, keep in mind that multiple aspects of our identities exist and shape our experiences simultaneously. They cannot be separated. If you are a white working-class male with a disability, all of those factors are playing a role in your life, worldviews, and experiences at the same time. As an example, my identity as a credentialed, highly literate person brings privilege in many ways. But my identity as a person of color and a woman bring challenges associated with being in a minoritized group. Take a moment to place your identities within the context of this chart. Privilege is based on one's social identities. There are various forms of privilege, including male privilege, heterosexual privilege, middle and upper class privilege, able-bodied privilege, white privilege, and the list continues. Dominant groups in all of the social categories have privileges or unearned advantages based on their group membership. Let's look at some examples of privilege. You have had the financial support of your family during college. You can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of your race widely represented. You do not have to think twice before calling the police if trouble occurs. You can have a bad day without it being attributed to your hormones or gender. You can walk at night without feeling unsafe. You are able to walk, see, or hear without assistance. You have been able to get opportunities or jobs due to familial connections. An important thing to remember about privilege is that it takes a lot of self-reflection and education to start recognizing your own privilege. But when you don't recognize your privilege, the way that you show up when you are around members of minoritized groups can easily fall into the category of unintentional harm. For example, if you are in a social group that has historically had their worldviews seen as the norm and their voices listened to and validated, it's possible that you could be impervious to the needs, struggles, and concerns of other people if you have not taken the time to reflect on your own privilege. Let's talk about how this may look in a higher education and student affairs context. For students who come from poor and working class backgrounds, there are barriers to their access to costly opportunities such as study abroad, service trips, conferences, football games, and the list continues. Students who practice faiths other than Christianity do not have their holidays and religious observances built into the academic calendar, so they may have to miss classes or make alternative arrangements for completing their work. Students of color may not encounter many faculty members or staff who look like them or who understand their unique struggles. Minoritized students face stereotyping, discrimination, and other forms of hostility from their peers, faculty, and staff. For students who are English language learners, there are significant language barriers and not enough resources. Students with visible and invisible disabilities face issues with accessibility on campus. There is not a lot of understanding, support, or resources for students dealing with visa and citizenship status issues. Many student affairs professionals are unaware of the unique challenges that international students face. The list of how issues of identity impact students is endless. What's important to remember is that in order to best serve all students, you need to have an awareness of your own privilege and blind spots. Many of us have not experienced some of the aforementioned challenges, but without having an increased awareness of these unique struggles, many of our students will continue to be underserved. Let's recap some of the main points from this session. Dominant groups are groups that have access to power in society. Minoritized groups are groups that do not have access to societal and institutional power. When we think of dominant and minoritized groups, it's important to think beyond individuals and to think in terms of systems. On the systemic level, which groups have historically had more access to societal power? Which groups have had to fight for basic rights and representation in society? Which groups are more represented in media, politics, and positions of power? Identity is complex and nuanced. Many of us have some dominant and some minoritized identities, which also means that we have some identities that come with privilege and others that do not. Remember, privilege is a taken for granted advantage that someone has based on their dominant group membership. It is important to reflect on our identities and privileges so that we do not cause unintentional harm and so that we can be more aware of the needs and experiences of others. Thank you for participating in this session. Don't forget to look into the recommended readings in order to get more information. Please respond to the reflection questions in order to complete this module.